Between 1947 and 1956, in a set of caves overlooking the Dead Sea, archaeologists found fragments of a book that had rewritten the entire story of Genesis, from creation to Moses, 1,000 years before anyone had heard of it doing so. 15 separate copies of it turned up at Qumran, more than of almost any book in the Hebrew Bible. According to this text, an angel dictated the true history of the world to Moses on Mount Sinai, correcting the calendar, correcting the timeline, and correcting details the Torah itself had left out. One church still reads it as scripture today. Nearly everyone else was told, centuries ago, to leave it out. This is the story of the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as a direct sequel and companion to the Torah, not a replacement for it. According to the text, while Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, an angel called the Angel of the Presence read to him from heavenly tablets, dictating a second, more detailed account of everything from the creation of the world through the Israelites' arrival at Sinai itself. The result covers the same ground as the book of Genesis and the opening chapters of Exodus, but it rarely just repeats what's already there. It fills in names, motives, and dates the biblical text leaves blank. Cain's wife is named and identified as his own sister, Awan. Seth marries his sister, Azurah. Abraham, according to the text, is said to endure exactly 10 trials of faith, a number and a framework that would later echo through rabbinic writing for centuries. Enoch, described here as the first human being taught to write, is credited with recording the secrets of astronomy and the calendar itself before being taken up to walk among the angels. Scholars generally date the book's composition to somewhere around 170 to 150 BCE, based on its clear literary relationship to sections of the Book of Enoch and to events surrounding the Maccabean revolt of the 160s BCE. Most researchers place its author as a Judean priestly figure, likely aligned with the Hasidian or early Essene movement, someone deeply invested in temple law, ritual purity, and above all, in a very specific argument about time itself. That argument is the real engine of the whole book, and it's the reason this text mattered so much to one particular community 150 years later. For most of modern history, nobody outside Ethiopia was reading the Book of Jubilees at all. Western scholars knew it existed only because early Christian writers like Epiphanius, Justin Martyr, and Origen quoted or referenced it, and because a single fragmentary Latin translation, covering roughly a quarter of the text, had survived by chance. The only complete copies anyone had access to were written in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, in manuscripts dating no earlier than the 1400s. That changed after 1947. Beginning that year and continuing through 1956, archaeologists working in 5 separate caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea recovered roughly 15 fragmentary scrolls of Jubilees, all written in Hebrew, some dated by handwriting analysis to around 100 BCE. Only Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Exodus, and Genesis are represented by more copies at Qumran, which tells scholars something important. Whoever lived at or used that settlement treated the Book of Jubilees as a central, frequently consulted text, not a marginal curiosity. When scholars, most notably James Vanderkam, compared the newly found Hebrew fragments against the centuries younger Ethiopic manuscripts, they found something remarkable. The Ge'ez version was, in the vast majority of cases, an accurate and strikingly literal translation, meaning the text Ethiopian Christians had preserved for half a millennium in relative isolation matched, almost line for line, a version buried in a Judean cave 2,000 years earlier. Christians in Ethiopia had translated Jubilees into Ge'ez sometime before the 6th century CE, and it entered what would become the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo biblical canon, where it remains today alongside the Book of Enoch as accepted scripture. It also holds a place in Haymanot Judaism, the tradition of the Ethiopian Jewish community known as the Beta Israel. Outside that region, Jubilees never gained that kind of lasting institutional home. It survived instead in the margins, quoted approvingly by early church writers across the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, even as it was never formally admitted into their scripture. The book's structure is built entirely around the number 7. Its very name comes from Jubilees, meaning cycles of 49 years, 7 sets of 7, and the text organizes all of history, from creation to the arrival at Sinai, into a precise sequence of these 49-year blocks. According to the text's own math, exactly 2,410 years pass between the creation and the moment Moses receives the law. Jubilees expands the angelic world considerably beyond anything in Genesis. It describes 4 classes of angels: angels of the presence, angels of sanctification, guardian angels assigned to individual nations and people, and angels who preside over natural phenomena like wind, fire, and the seasons. It also retells, with its own additions, the story from Genesis 6 of heavenly beings who took human wives and fathered a race of giants, the Nephilim, wiped out afterward in the flood. According to the text, God allowed 1/10 of their disembodied spirits to remain on earth afterward, tasked with leading humanity astray, a detail meant to explain the ongoing presence of evil and temptation in the world. The book also claims that Hebrew was the original language spoken in Eden by animals and humans alike, lost after the expulsion from the garden and largely forgotten after the Tower of Babel until angels taught it again to Abraham. It's a small detail, but it reveals something about the author's larger project. This is a text obsessed with restoring what it considers to be the correct original version of sacred history, filling every gap Genesis left open with an answer. The book also contains one of the earliest known versions of a story that would go on to have a long afterlife in Jewish tradition, the 10 Trials of Abraham, later developed further in the Mishnah and in medieval commentary by figures like Rashi and Maimonides. And in a detail that scholars have long connected to the New Testament's own epistle to the Galatians, Jubilees presents the law given to Moses not as delivered directly by God, but as dictated through an angelic intermediary, the angel of the presence, an idea about angelic mediation of the law that shows up again centuries later in Paul's own letters. All of that narrative expansion, the angels, the giants, the retellings, serves a purpose that becomes clear in chapter 6 of the book, and it's the real reason Jubilees existed in the first place: a fight over the calendar. According to the text, God gave humanity a 364-day solar year, divided into 4 equal quarters of 13 weeks each, and this, not the standard lunar calendar most of Judea was using, was the true, divinely ordained system for counting time. The text is explicit that departing from this calendar was itself a form of religious corruption, warning that people who followed a 354-day lunar year, the calendar actually in common use, would forget the new moons and appointed times and Sabbaths and lose track of the correct dates for observing every festival God had commanded. The advantage of 364 is mathematical. It divides evenly by 7, meaning every year contains exactly 52 full weeks, and every festival lands on the same day of the week, year after year, forever. A lunar calendar drifts. This one, on paper, doesn't. Modern researchers studying Qumran's manuscripts have continued to investigate just how rigorously this calendar was actually followed there, and some recent scholarship suggests the community's real-world attempts to reconcile a fixed 364-day count with the actual solar year eventually ran into the same drift problems they were trying to avoid, since 364 is not, in fact, the true length of a solar year either. This is not a small theological footnote. It's very likely the central reason the community that collected the Dead Sea Scrolls valued Jubilees as highly as they did, since their own sect appears to have followed this same solar calendar in direct opposition to the lunar calendar used by the temple establishment in Jerusalem. Getting the calendar wrong in this worldview didn't just mean showing up to a festival on the wrong day. It meant the entire priesthood running the temple was performing its sacrifices and observances out of sync with heaven itself. That is almost certainly why Jubilees never had a chance at entering the mainstream Jewish canon that took shape in the centuries after the temple's destruction in 70 CE. Rabbinic Judaism settled firmly on a lunar-based calendar, and a text built entirely around discrediting that system and elevating a rival one had no path into that tradition's scripture. There's no record of Jubilees appearing in Pharisaic or later rabbinic literature as an accepted text, even though, as later scholars would document, individual stories and interpretations from within it, like the 10 trials of Abraham or details about Enoch's education by angels, kept resurfacing anyway in works like Bereshit Rabbah and the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, centuries after the book itself had been pushed to the margins. Christian tradition handled it differently again. Early church writers across the Mediterranean, from Origen to Isidore of Seville, continued citing Jubilees for generations, treating it as a useful, credible historical source, even while it never became part of the officially recognized Old Testament in the churches that would go on to define the Western and Eastern canons. Only in Ethiopia, where the church's canon developed along its own independent path, did Jubilees end up formally inside the Bible instead of just alongside it. The Book of Jubilees is a genuinely unusual case among excluded texts, because it wasn't rejected for being strange, fringe, or unknown. It was one of the most heavily copied works at Qumran. It shaped later rabbinic storytelling, even after being formally excluded from rabbinic scripture. It influenced early Christian writers across several centuries. And it holds actual scriptural status today, not as a historical footnote, but as living canon within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and Ethiopian Jewish tradition. What kept it out of the Bible, most people know, wasn't a question of authorship or age, the usual disqualifiers for texts like this. It was a direct, calculated challenge to how an entire religious establishment measured time itself, tied to a specific sectarian dispute in Judea in the century before the temple's destruction, a dispute the winning side of Jewish tradition eventually moved past entirely. It leaves behind a genuinely striking question. If the version of the Bible most people know today is, in part, the record of which calendar happened to win, what does it mean that an entire alternate history of Genesis, complete with its own dating system for all of human history, survived for 2,000 years in a cave and a mountain kingdom, waiting for both halves of the story to finally be compared side by side? The Book of Jubilees shows how a rejected calendar could keep a book out of the Bible for 2,000 years, in every tradition except one. In the next video, we're looking at the Testament of Solomon, a text that claims to record the exact methods King Solomon used to command demons into building his temple. If you want to keep discovering the text that almost made it into the Bible, subscribe. There's a lot more of this history still buried.